The waves swallowed him whole, dragging him into the abyss. Lost, alone, miles from shore, his fate seemed sealed. But what happened next would prove the unbreakable spirit of a German shepherd. The sky stretched endlessly over the Atlantic, its deep blue mirroring the restless waves below. Sunlight danced across the water's surface, disguising the depth and danger lurking beneath. The Celeste Dawn, a sleek white yacht, carved effortlessly through the waves, its polished exterior gleaming under the afternoon sun. Aboard, laughter echoed, a celebration of life, leisure, and adventure. But amidst the carefree revelry, one soul remained vigilant. His name was Max. Max wasn't just any dog, he was a German shepherd, a guardian, a protector. His body, sculpted by years of movement and training, stood strong and imposing. His sable coat shimmered in the sunlight, the dark saddle pattern marking him with an air of distinction. But it was his eyes, amber pools of wisdom and unwavering devotion, that set him apart. He had been at his owner's side since he was a pup, raised not as a pet, but as a partner. Ethan Marshall, a former Navy veteran turned marine biologist, had rescued Max from a shelter 5 years ago. Their bond was forged in mutual trust, cemented by time and the countless adventures they had shared. Ethan wasn't the type to revel in luxury, but today was different. It was his fiancée, Claire's, birthday, and she had insisted they take a trip with friends. Claire, a travel journalist with an infectious love for the ocean, had always dreamed of a getaway like this, an escape into the deep blue with nothing but open skies and the freedom of the waves. Max, ever watchful, patrolled the deck with measured steps, his ears flicking at every sound. He wasn't nervous, just aware. His protective instincts were always on alert, a silent guardian standing watch over his pack. Despite his disciplined nature, Max had always loved the ocean. He had grown up running along the shorelines of Key West, chasing the surf and diving into the rolling waves with reckless joy. Ethan had trained him well, ensuring he could swim powerfully, his lean muscles cutting through the water as efficiently as any trained rescuer. There were stories of dogs who had saved drowning sailors, of canines that had braved the stormy tides to bring their humans back to shore. Max had that same spirit, but no amount of training could have prepared him for what was coming. The afternoon sun hung high, golden light stretching across the endless horizon. The guests on board sipped champagne, their laughter rising above the rhythmic crash of the waves against the hull. Claire, wearing a flowing white sundress, stood near the bow, the wind whipping her hair around her face. Ethan leaned against the railing beside her, one arm wrapped around her waist. He glanced down at Max, who sat by his feet, his ears perked. "You're on duty, huh?" Ethan murmured with a smile, scratching behind Max's ear. The dog leaned into the touch, his tail wagging ever so slightly. Claire laughed. "He never relaxes, does he?" Ethan shook his head. "Not when he's got something to protect." Claire turned toward him, resting her chin on his shoulder. "That's why you love him so much. He's just like you." Ethan smirked. "I don't know about that. He might be the smarter one." The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. The ocean stretched out like a living canvas, rippling under the gentle embrace of the evening breeze. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A rogue wave struck the yacht, tilting it sharply to one side. The laughter turned to startled gasps as drinks spilled and guests grabbed onto whatever they could for balance. Plates slid across the table, and a bottle of wine toppled, shattering on the deck. Max, instinctively lowering his stance, braced himself, his claws scraping against the wooden floor. He let out a sharp bark, his senses heightened. Claire let out a shriek as her sun hat was swept away by the wind, but Ethan caught her in time, steadying her against the sudden lurch. But Max had no such safety net. The force of the tilt sent him sliding, his paws scrambling for purchase. The railing loomed closer, his body weight shifting uncontrollably. In that fraction of a second, time seemed to slow. He saw Ethan turning toward him, his mouth open in a shout. Then, the world flipped. Max's hind legs lost traction, and the deck seemed to vanish beneath him. His front paws stretched out, claws extended, grasping for something, anything, to stop his fall. But there was nothing. The last thing Max saw before he plunged into the churning depths was Ethan's outstretched hand reaching for him, too late. The water swallowed him whole, cold and unforgiving. The impact was a shock, stealing the air from his lungs. Salt water rushed around him, engulfing him in a suffocating embrace. The yacht's hull loomed above, growing smaller as he was pulled downward by the force of his fall. Max kicked his legs, his instincts taking over. He knew how to swim. He had done it 100 times before. But this was different. The ocean was vast, unrelenting. The waves moved against him, pushing him further away from the yacht. Above, the celeste dawn continued to glide forward, unaware that one of its own had been lost to the sea. Max's heart pounded as he fought against the pull of the current. He turned his head, searching for the familiar shape of the boat, but it was drifting further and further away. He let out a bark, a desperate cry, but the wind carried it away. Ethan. He knew Ethan would come for him. He had to. The sky was getting darker, the yacht disappearing into the distance. Max paddled furiously, his muscles burning, but the current was merciless, dragging him further from the boat. He kept his head above water, his ears flicking, listening, waiting for the sound of an engine, the voice of his master calling out his name. But there was nothing. Only the endless ocean, stretching in every direction. Max was alone, and the night was closing in. The yacht drifted further away, its towering white hull shrinking against the vast horizon. The ocean swallowed every sound, the laughter and music from above now nothing more than a ghostly echo lost in the wind. Max fought against the panic rising in his chest. His legs kicked furiously, pushing against the weight of the water, but the current was a living thing, powerful, relentless, dragging him away from everything he knew. He let out another desperate bark, his voice cracking against the wind. Ethan. The name was more than a thought, it was a plea. His master had never failed him, never left him behind. Max knew, deep in his bones, that Ethan would come. But the sea was vast, its waves indifferent, and the yacht was still moving. He had to stay afloat, he had to survive. Salt stung his eyes as he paddled, his body moving on instinct, muscle memory kicking in. He'd swum before, countless times in calmer waters, along the shore, through rivers, even against strong currents when training with Ethan. But this was different. The Atlantic stretched infinitely in every direction, its deep blue depths concealing things he couldn't see, couldn't predict. The weight of the water pulled at him, his fur heavy and soaked. Every wave that crashed against him felt like a wall, forcing him backward, stealing his breath. Still, he swam. The sun was sinking now, dipping below the horizon in a blaze of fiery orange. Shadows stretched across the ocean's surface, turning the water into a shifting mass of darkness. The yacht was gone. The realization hit him like a blow. The celeste dawn had vanished into the distance, lost to the fading light. For the first time in his life, Max was truly alone. A cold fear slithered through him, but he shoved it aside. Panic wouldn't help. Fear was the enemy. Survive. He had to think. Max turned his head, scanning the horizon. There had to be something. Land, a passing boat, any sign of hope. But there was nothing but water. Endless, merciless water. His breaths came in sharp gasps, his chest tightening. He was strong, but even he had limits. His muscles burned, his powerful legs already aching from the effort of keeping himself afloat. The current wasn't slowing. If anything, it was growing stronger, dragging him further from where he had fallen. And then, a shadow moved beneath him. A flicker of something deep below, shifting in the murky depths. Max's ears perked, his heart hammering. His instincts screamed a warning, a primal alert passed down through generations of survival. Something was down there. The ocean was not empty. He kept paddling, but his body tensed. His mind raced through possibilities. Sharks, barracudas, predators that lurked beneath the waves, unseen but ever present. He had heard Ethan talk about them, had smelled them on the beaches they had visited. Another flicker. Closer this time. Max turned sharply, his body twisting in the water, his amber eyes strained against the shifting darkness. And then, movement. A sleek, sinuous shape passed just beneath him, cutting through the water with terrifying grace. Max's breath hitched. A shark. Not massive, but large enough. Its pale underbelly flashed as it moved, its tail sweeping through the current. Max went still, his instincts taking over. Do not thrash. Do not act like prey. His muscles locked as he floated, his legs barely moving. The shark circled lazily, slow and deliberate, as if curious about this strange creature adrift in its domain. Max held his breath. Seconds stretched into eternity. The ocean pressed around him, silent and vast. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the shadow drifted away, disappearing into the abyss below. Max exhaled sharply, forcing himself to move again. He couldn't stop. He had to keep going. But where? His body was tiring. The fight against the current was endless, every stroke of his legs a battle. His breathing had grown ragged, each breath a little harder to take. How long could he last? He shook his head, water flying from his drenched fur. Number. He couldn't let himself weaken. Ethan was coming. He had to believe that. The night deepened, the last remnants of sunlight swallowed by the encroaching dark. The stars blinked to life above him, scattered like shattered glass across the sky. The ocean had changed. Without the sun, it was something else entirely. An abyss, a void that stretched endlessly beneath him. The water had grown colder, a biting chill creeping into his bones. He forced himself to keep moving. The wind howled across the waves, a cruel and indifferent force. The ocean, once shimmering and playful, had become a predator in its own right, merciless and unyielding. A wave struck him hard, sending him under. For a terrifying moment, he was weightless, tossed like a rag doll in the sea's relentless grip. Water filled his nose, his ears. The world spun. He kicked furiously, fighting against the force dragging him downward. His lungs burned. Then, air. He broke the surface, gasping, coughing up salt water. His legs trembled with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. Survive. His body screamed for rest, but rest meant sinking. Rest meant drowning. He wouldn't let that happen. Not here. Not like this. His thoughts drifted to Ethan, to the warmth of his voice, the strong grip of his hands, the safety of his presence. Ethan was coming. He had to be. Max lifted his head, his weary eyes scanning the horizon, and then a light. Faint, distant, a flicker in the darkness. Max's heart surged. Hope. He turned toward it, summoning every last ounce of strength. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but he swam. The light grew brighter, steady, unwavering. A boat, a chance. Max pushed forward, his body numb with exhaustion but his spirit refusing to break. The ocean roared around him, the waves rising higher, trying to pull him under. But Max was a fighter, he was Ethan's dog, and he was not giving up. Not now. Not ever. The night pressed down upon him, suffocating and relentless. The sky was a vast, empty abyss, its stars distant and indifferent. The ocean stretched in every direction, black and endless, a living, breathing thing that sought to consume him. Max had never known fear like this. His body was failing. Every movement felt sluggish, every stroke of his legs an unbearable weight. The cold had seeped deep into his muscles, numbing him from the inside out. The salt water clung to his fur like chains, dragging him down with every breath. But he couldn't stop. Stopping meant sinking. Sinking meant dying. And Max refused to die. He focused on the light, the faint glimmer that still flickered in the distance. It was so small, so fragile, like a star on the horizon. But it was hope. It was the only thing keeping him alive. His legs kicked harder, his paws slicing through the water. His chest burned with every breath, but he pushed forward, fighting against the current, against the exhaustion, against the vastness of the sea that threatened to swallow him whole. Then the sea fought back. A wave rose before him, towering and monstrous, a wall of water that blocked out the sky. Max had no time to react. It crashed down upon him with brutal force, dragging him under. The world flipped. Water rushed into his nose, his ears, his throat. He tumbled through the dark, the weight of the ocean pressing down on him like an anchor. His instincts screamed at him to fight, to kick, to push toward the surface. But which way was up? The darkness was absolute, disorienting. The pressure in his lungs built, a searing pain that threatened to explode. He needed air. Desperation took over. He kicked blindly, his claws raking through the water. His body burned, his vision flickering with dark spots. Then, light. A shimmer, just above him. Max lunged upward with everything he had left, his legs trembling, his body screaming for relief. He broke the surface, coughing, gasping, dragging air into his burning lungs. His chest heaved as he fought to stay afloat, his body shaking violently. The light. Where was it? He turned his head, panic rising in his throat. It was still there, but further now. The wave had stolen his progress, had dragged him backward into the abyss. A whimper escaped his throat. Number, he couldn't lose it. He couldn't lose them. Max forced himself forward again, his limbs heavy, each movement agony. His vision blurred, his breath shallow. He had to keep going. He had to survive. The ocean churned around him, the current shifting unpredictably. One moment it pushed him forward, the next it yanked him back, as if toying with him, daring him to give up. But he wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. Then, something changed. A sound. Distant, barely audible over the wind and waves, but unmistakable. A voice. Max's ears perked, his body snapping to attention despite the exhaustion. He knew that voice. Ethan. Hope surged through him like fire, igniting something deep within his chest. He let out a bark, loud, desperate, raw. He listened, his body stilling despite the churning water around him. Then, cutting through the night. Max! It was faint, but it was real. Ethan was out there. Max barked again, his voice cracking from exhaustion. He kicked harder, his body moving with renewed purpose. The light was closer now, stronger. He could see it bobbing, swaying. It wasn't just a distant glow. It was a boat. They were searching for him. Ethan had come. Max pushed forward with everything he had left. His vision blurred, his legs screamed, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. And then, a beam of light swept across the waves. It passed over him. Max barked, a frantic, desperate cry. The light swung back. It landed on him. A shout from the boat. The engine roared as the vessel changed direction, heading toward him. Max paddled harder, his body trembling from exhaustion and cold. The boat drew closer, cutting through the waves. Then, through the darkness, Ethan's face. He was leaning over the side, his eyes wild, scanning the water. Max! Max let out a final exhausted bark. Ethan saw him. Relief flooded Ethan's face. Hold on, buddy. We're coming. A rope splashed into the water. A lifeline. Max lunged for it, clamping down with what little strength he had left. The boat rocked as Ethan hauled him in, his arms straining. Max's vision blurred, the edges of his world fading. Then, hands, strong, warm, familiar. Ethan's arms wrapped around him, lifting him from the water, pulling him into safety. Max collapsed against him, his body shaking uncontrollably. The cold still clung to him, but it no longer mattered. Ethan was here. I got you, buddy. I got you. Max let out a weak whimper, pressing his face against Ethan's chest. He was home. Max lay motionless in Ethan's arms, his body trembling violently from exhaustion and the biting cold. Water streamed from his soaked fur, pooling onto the boat's wooden deck. Every breath was a struggle, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. The ocean had tried to take him, had nearly won, but he was still here. Ethan cradled him against his chest, his grip strong yet shaking. His heart pounded against Max's side, a frantic, erratic rhythm that mirrored the terror in his eyes. "You're okay," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now, buddy." But Max wasn't okay. The fight had drained him. His muscles, once powerful and unyielding, were now weak, barely able to hold him upright. His paws twitched involuntarily, his body trying to shake off the trauma of what had just happened. Ethan pressed his forehead against Max's wet fur, his breath shuddering. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. "I thought—" His voice broke. Max let out a weak whimper, nudging his head against Ethan's arm. He was still there. He hadn't given up, but his body could take no more. The boat rocked gently beneath them as the waves calmed, as if the ocean itself had finally relented. The crew, silent and solemn, stood around them, their faces pale from the gravity of what they had just witnessed. Claire knelt beside Ethan, her eyes brimming with tears. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing over Max's damp fur. "Is he—" "He's alive," Ethan choked out. "Barely." Max's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, but he was too weak to lift his head. His eyelids drooped, his body slowly succumbing to the exhaustion. "No, no, no," Ethan said quickly, shifting to keep him awake. "Stay with me, Max. We're not done yet." He turned to the crew, his voice sharp despite the panic. "We need blankets, now." One of the crew members rushed to the storage compartment, returning seconds later with thick, dry blankets. Ethan wrapped them tightly around Max, rubbing his sides, trying to force warmth back into his frozen body. But Max's breathing was slowing. Ethan felt the weight of fear grip his chest. He had fought too hard to lose him now. "Come on, buddy," he murmured. "Stay with me, just a little longer." The boat's engine rumbled as the captain turned them back toward the shore, pushing the vessel to its highest speed. The yacht, the place where the celebration had begun, was long gone, its luxury and laughter meaningless now. Nothing mattered except getting Max to safety. Ethan's hands never stopped moving, his fingers running through Max's fur, his touch a silent plea for him to hold on. He wasn't just a dog, he was family. Minutes stretched into eternity as the boat cut through the dark waters. The city lights shimmered in the distance, a beacon of safety, of home. But Ethan didn't dare look away from Max. He couldn't. Max's eyes flickered open slightly, heavy and unfocused. His breath was slow, but it was still there. Ethan exhaled shakily. "That's it," he murmured. "You're doing great, bud." Claire placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, her touch grounding him. "We'll get him through this," she said softly. "He's strong." Ethan nodded, though the fear didn't leave his face. He had never felt so helpless. By the time they reached the dock, an emergency vet was already waiting, alerted by a desperate call from Claire. The moment the boat touched land, Ethan scooped Max into his arms, ignoring the fire in his own muscles, the weight of exhaustion threatening to pull him down. Max let out a faint whine, his head pressing against Ethan's chest. "I got you," Ethan whispered. The vet, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and steady hands, gestured toward a waiting vehicle. "Bring him in. We need to get his body temperature up." Ethan didn't hesitate. He carried Max as fast as he could, Claire running beside him. The world around them was a blur, blaring horns, distant voices, city lights flickering overhead. Nothing else existed except the weight in his arms. The vet's clinic was small, but warm, the air filled with the sterile scent of medicine and clean linens. The moment they entered, an assistant rushed forward, guiding them to a heated examination table. Ethan gently placed Max down, his hands reluctant to let go. The vet wasted no time. She checked his vitals, listening to his heartbeat, monitoring his breathing. She worked with calm precision, her face unreadable. Ethan hovered beside her, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. "Is he—" "He's stable," the vet said after a long pause. but he's severely hypothermic. His body has been through hell. She glanced at Ethan, her expression softer now. It's a miracle he made it this far. Ethan swallowed hard. He had known it was bad, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. Max let out a slow, exhausted breath. His eyes fluttered open again, just enough to meet Ethan's gaze. Relief flooded through Ethan's chest. He reached out, his hand resting against Max's head. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." The vet adjusted the warming blankets around Max, making sure the heat reached deep into his core. "He needs rest, a lot of it, but he's a fighter." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Claire squeezed his hand. "He made it." Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Max was alive. That was all that mattered. The minutes stretched into hours. Ethan refused to leave, his chair pulled up beside Max's table. His fingers brushed absently through the thick fur that had once been vibrant and full of life, now damp and matted. Max had always been the strongest, the bravest. Seeing him like this, weak, vulnerable, felt like a punch to the gut. "You scared the hell out of me," Ethan murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Max's tail twitched slightly, a ghost of a wag. Ethan let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, I know. I should have had more faith." Claire leaned against the wall, watching the quiet exchange. "You saved him, Ethan." Ethan sighed. "He saved himself. I just got lucky." The vet re-entered the room, glancing at the monitors. "His vitals are improving. His temperature is almost back to normal." Ethan let out another slow breath. The storm had passed. Max had won. Ethan leaned forward, pressing a kiss to Max's head. "You did good, buddy." Max let out a low, content sigh, his body finally relaxing into the warmth. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, Ethan allowed himself to believe it. Max was going to be okay. The clinic was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor beside Max's bed. The storm of the night had passed, the chaos replaced by a fragile stillness. Ethan hadn't moved from his spot. He sat beside Max, one hand resting gently on the dog's thick fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. For hours, he had watched, waited, barely breathing himself as the warmth slowly returned to Max's body. Every shiver, every twitch had sent a spike of fear through him. But now, finally, Max was resting peacefully. The vet had assured Ethan that his companion would recover, slowly but fully. Still, Ethan couldn't bring himself to relax. Not yet. Claire re-entered the room, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. She placed one beside Ethan, nudging it toward him. "You need to drink something," she murmured. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his tired eyes. "I'm fine." Claire gave him a knowing look but didn't argue. She settled into the chair beside him, her gaze flickering toward Max. "He's strong. He's going to be okay." Ethan nodded, but the lump in his throat wouldn't let him speak. The memories of the night still clung to him, vivid and unrelenting. The moment he had realized Max was gone, the crushing helplessness of searching the dark waters, the overwhelming relief when he had found him, barely holding on. He had faced danger before. He had seen loss. But nothing had prepared him for the sheer terror of almost losing Max. "I should have noticed sooner," he murmured, his voice rough. "I should have." Claire reached over, squeezing his arm. "Ethan, you saved him." He looked at her, guilt clouding his features. "I almost didn't." Claire sighed, shaking her head. "You think Max blames you?" Ethan glanced down at Max, watching as his tail gave the faintest wag in response to Claire's voice. Max didn't blame him. Ethan let out a shaky laugh, running a hand over his face. "He never lets me stay mad at myself, does he?" Claire smiled softly. "That's what makes him so special." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the quiet hum of the machines. Ethan reached for Max's paw, holding it gently between his fingers. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he whispered. Max let out a low, content sigh, his body shifting slightly under the blankets. He was home. He was safe. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. A long road to recovery. The next few days passed in a haze of careful monitoring, gentle reassurances, and sleepless nights. Max remained weak, but with each passing hour, his strength began to return. Ethan stayed by his side through it all. He brought food to the clinic, though he barely touched it himself. He slept in short, restless bursts, only allowing himself rest when the vet insisted. Max, despite his exhaustion, tried to comfort Ethan in his own way. His eyes followed him whenever he moved, his tail wagged, weak but steady, each time Ethan spoke. By the third day he was able to lift his head on his own. By the fourth, he managed to sit up, though his legs still trembled under his weight. By the end of the week, he took his first steps. They were shaky, uncertain, but Ethan was there, his hands hovering close, ready to catch him if he faltered. Max's determination mirrored his own. They had survived the impossible together, and now they would heal together. A homecoming like no other. When the vet finally cleared Max to leave, Ethan felt a weight lift from his chest. It was strange, how different the world seemed now. The ocean, once vast and merciless, now shimmered under the morning sun, calm and inviting. The sky stretched endlessly above them, unburdened by the storm. Max stood beside Ethan at the clinic's entrance, his legs still a bit unsteady, but his spirit unbroken. Claire smiled, kneeling beside him. "Ready to go home, Max?" Max let out a quiet huff, his tail wagging gently. Ethan ran a hand through his fur, his throat tight. "Let's go, bud." The drive home was quiet. Max lay in the back seat, his head resting on his paws, his ears twitching at the familiar sounds of the city. When they finally arrived, Ethan opened the car door and stepped out, waiting as Max took his time before jumping down. The house had never felt more like home. Max sniffed the air, taking in the scents, the familiarity of it all. His tail wagged a little faster now, a spark of excitement flickering in his tired eyes. Ethan knelt beside him. "Yeah," he murmured. "We made it." Max nudged his face against Ethan's hand, a silent thank you. And for the first time in days, Ethan smiled. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over Ethan's small but cozy home. The salty breeze from the ocean drifted through the open windows, carrying the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. The storm, the struggle, the endless night at sea. It all felt like a distant nightmare now, something that had happened in another life. But the reminders were still there. Max lay stretched out by the sliding glass doors, his head resting on his paws, his ears twitching at every small sound. He was resting, but his eyes remained half open, always aware, always watching. He had been given a second chance, but his body was still recovering from the ordeal. The exhaustion hadn't fully left him, nor had the deep ache in his muscles from the miles he had swum. Ethan sat beside him, his back against the couch, staring out at the waves beyond the window. His fingers absent-mindedly ran through Max's thick fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. "You scared me, buddy," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of the past few days. "I thought I lost you out there." Max let out a soft huff, his tail giving the faintest wag as if to say, "I made it. I'm here." Ethan swallowed hard, trying to push away the lump in his throat. He had always known Max was special. But now, after everything they had been through, he realized something deeper. Max wasn't just his dog, he was his family. The bond they shared was unbreakable, forged not just through training, but through trust, through love, through the sheer will to hold on to each other no matter what. Max had fought with everything he had to survive, to return to the one person who had always been by his side, and Ethan had fought just as hard to bring him home. Claire appeared in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She handed one to Ethan before settling onto the floor beside him, her knee brushing against his. You gonna be okay? She asked softly. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on Max before nodding. Yeah, we're gonna be okay. Claire smiled. He's a fighter, you know, just like you. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, rubbing Max's ears gently. Yeah, well, I think he might be stronger than me. Claire nudged him playfully. I don't know. You did jump into a boat in the middle of the night and go after him. That takes a different kind of strength. Ethan shook his head, his smile fading slightly. I had to. There was no other choice. I couldn't leave him out there. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of waves and the soft rustling of the trees outside. It was a peaceful moment, one that neither of them took for granted. But in that silence, something else lingered. A realization, a purpose. Ethan looked down at Max, watching the way his breathing had steadied, the way he had found comfort in being home again. And something inside him shifted. I want to do something, he said suddenly. Claire tilted her head. Like what? I want to share Max's story, Ethan said, his voice growing stronger. Not just for us, but for anyone out there who needs to know that hope isn't lost, that no matter how dark things get, you keep swimming. Claire studied him for a moment, then smiled. Then let's do it. Ethan let out a breath, as if saying the words had lifted something heavy off his chest. He reached down, scratching behind Max's ears. What do you say, bud? Think you're ready to inspire the world? Max thumped his tail against the floor, his golden eyes full of understanding. He didn't need to speak. Ethan already knew his answer, because some stories didn't need words to be powerful. Some stories were told in the way a dog refuses to give up, in the way he fights through exhaustion and fear, in the way he swims through miles of darkness just to find his way home. Max's story wasn't just about survival. It was about loyalty. It was about love. It was about never letting go of the ones who mean the most. And now it was a story the world needed to hear.